So, as Hall puts it, the heritage, with a big H, invariably reflects the governing assumptions of its time and context. It's always inflected by the power and the authority of those who have colonised the past, whose versions of history matter. And the groups who got to define and who possessed heritage, and they're pretty much one and the same thing, were mainly upper or upper middle class white people, and particularly men. Their whiteness became naturalised through its predominantly unspoken nature, and its invisibility functioned to present an image of its neutrality and to lever power. So I'm sure this is a common story that many of you are familiar with. So we might say that in European and American societies throughout industrial modernity then, heritage became one of a range of sites through which superiority and power could be naturalised and sustained. And we might think, for example, of statues of white military heroes in city centres that kind of offer very visible evidence of imperial victory, or public museums, old-fashioned public museums in particular, with their big pillars at the entrance, which were designed to evoke ideas about white Greek and white Roman civilizations. Or we might think about open access stately homes and how they encourage the visitor traditionally to come and experience the kind of rural residence of the white aristocracy and to feel humble and overawed in their presence. And this is what Carol Duncan has called civilising rituals. And they work, as Hall puts it, to show just who is in charge. The heritage with a capital H, therefore, is something that's very highly selective, yet it achieved its power through a kind of cultural grammar of universality. And so heritage that was deemed as other just doesn't count. And I think this becomes really clear when you think about how there's still this really common idea in circulation that Europe has an older heritage than America. It's still really common, an idea. You still get it in a lot of tourist guides. And this illustrates this point too, because Native American Indian heritage in this schema just doesn't count. That's not heritage. So the kind of linkages between heritage and race and nation historically work together to prop each other up. So as we know, over the past few decades, and not least by work like Ingrid Pollard's that you'll see later, there's been a lot of challenges to this idea of the heritage and a lot of disruptions of its singularity. The smug certainties of a bounded heritage belonging to a white upper and upper middle class have been punctured. Their claims to be able to speak for other cultures have been challenged, and their singularity has been multiplied. Hall terms this shift as a deep slow-motion revolution which is still in process, and he notes that it's taking place in a broader context in which Enlightenment ideas about universality and universal knowledge are being dismantled. And this shift has been quite slow, yet it's also been quite monumental, and it's taken a variety of forms. So, for example, we might think about how the expansion of the so-called heritage industry in Britain and America and the rest of Europe in the 80s often involved a kind of expansion of what was thought of as heritage in class terms. So, for example, experience attractions that you could go and visit, like Jorvik and Ironbridge, provided a type of arena where domestic and everyday heritage became foregrounded. And so this was a way in which heritage became expanded to embrace so-called history from below. And this offered a very significant shift, and particularly in terms of gender, because a lot of these types of sites were concerned with domesticity and showing how women lived in the past as well as men. But at the same time, they were often roundly critiqued at the time for offering what was often termed a kind of Thatcherism in period dress, a kind of marketised populism that offered a very commercial idea of the past on the one hand. And we might also think about how those experience attractions, like the debates that discuss them, the so-called heritage debates in cultural studies, were pretty much, they were still concerned with whiteness, even though that wasn't very critiqued. And they still depended in a lot of ways on very imperial narratives that weren't problematised. So that's one way in which the heritage multiplied, but only multiplied in quite limited ways. At the same time, we might think about how the insights of post-colonialism were being very busily pursued across the heritage sector in a number of different contexts with varying degrees of success. So, for example, in particular, the kind of Euro-Americans museums claimed to be able to speak on behalf of other cultures became more roundly questioned over the past few decades, and its legacies as a kind of showcase for imperial bounty became more problematised and more questioned. And this broadly took place in terms of what became known as the new museology, which sought to educate a whole generation of curators into thinking through these issues more seriously. So increasingly, more public-owned museums and gallery spaces turned their attention to thinking about so-called other cultures. And the overused example here was the exhibition at Walsall City Art Gallery featuring Sikh art. And this, as Nassim Khan terms it in her 1976 report, The Arts Britain Ignores, gradually public museums and galleries weren't ignoring these so-called other cultures. They became slightly less ignored. So that's another way, a second way in which the heritage became multiplied. But we might also think about how these examples in themselves weren't particularly new. They weren't without precedent, as a range of grassroots examples and initiatives have for a very long time been working on multiplying ideas about the heritage that hadn't been given such popularity, such publicity. And as Stuart Hall again has put it, like the rainbow, this work has come and gone, because there are ways in which it's very difficult for grassroots initiatives to get funding, which mainstream big public museums don't necessarily experience. And that's still the case, as I'm sure people will be talking about later today. So that's a third way in which the heritage became multiplied. And fourthly, we might talk about how heritage has emerged as a kind of object for government and policy attention. So it's increasingly being thought of as something which might be used in government terms as a kind of strategy to address racialised inequalities and to address social inclusion. And as Richard Sandel puts it, heritage institutions from the 80s were increasingly working to explore what he calls their contribution towards the combating of social as well as cultural inequality. And they're encouraged to do so through government policy initiatives in Britain and also transnational policy initiatives. So, for example, reports like Not for the Likes of You and the catchily titled Building on Pat 10 tried to encourage ways of social inclusion through heritage policy. So taken collectively, Hall's kind of singular heritage has become a bit more plural and has resulted in a range of approaches, the good, the bad and the downright ugly. And I think one means of discussing how heritage and race is being reconfigured now is by thinking about some of the problems that are often noticed in this area or commented on. So that's what I want to do now. I want to talk about a few problematic positions that we might think of as existing in terms of heritage and ideas about race, or problems that I have with how heritage negotiates with the ideas of race. So I have this list of problematic positions.